Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful to present on behalf of ISACA. How many here know what ISACA is, just before I start off? There's a couple, there's a few faces I'm familiar with. That's excellent. So ISACA is an international global association similar to IIA. We focus primarily in the IT audit space, IT security, IT governance, that kind of area. What I wanted to talk about today, and it was interesting, Jeff has covered some areas, and you're going to see some interesting threads coming through. The next session also on risk appetite is of interest because I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then there's a session later on change and transformation. I'm going to make some references to innovation and change as well. So there's some threads going to come out of my session today. A challenge that I had was cybersecurity is such a broad topic. It could mean so many different things to different people. It depends on the industry you're in, it depends on the role you take, it depends on the degree of change and the degree of technology your organisation is using. So I actually, kind of opposite of Jeff, I've taken a pretty broad brush here. I don't profess to cover in 30, 35 minutes everything about cybersecurity. What I hope to do, though, is to leave you with some areas in my slide deck where you can come back later and say, what was that bullet point that Gary had in there that I need to do, perhaps a deeper exploration of? What was that point he made about something that was relevant that we should look at? My details are at the end if you want to catch back up with me later. I will be here for morning tea as well. So let's have a look at this. I've got to point it over there. All right. I've got a fairly substantial agenda, so let me move fairly quickly through it. Let's start with the emerging cyber risk landscape. This isn't actually that new. I was involved in some of New South Wales government's first deployment of government to business and government to consumer services in 1999, okay? So we were doing this stuff for a long time. This is not new. It surprises me the time it's taken to get it up onto board agendas. I know back in 1999, it was certainly on the agenda of our board that I was working for back then. But it has taken some time to get there. And why is that? There's three fundamental drivers, and ISACA produced a bit of a guide for organisations, and I have an image of it on the screen there if you want to have a look at that later. There are three things that brought it together, and we're seeing this fundamentally happening right now. Anyone here with a 10-year-old who's doing coding? Okay, writing software code. My daughter does now. She wants to write her own Minecraft game, which is kind of fascinating. So what we're seeing in the bottom corner there, we're seeing social stratification of IT skills. We're seeing children learning how to use technology from almost the time they can walk and talk, perhaps, through things like iPads and iPhones and other devices and being able to communicate. Why is that important? Because they're sometimes consumers of the products that we are building and deploying out there on the internet. We're seeing also, I remember back in the 90s when I was doing lots of IT audit, the IT audit expertise and IT security expertise was very limited. There were not so many people out there that knew how to write code, that knew how to undertake an IT audit, that knew how to secure or configure a system, that knew how to build and deploy a firewall, that knew how to operate broader IT infrastructure for an enterprise. But we're seeing a lot more people in this space now, a lot more skills diversification, a lot more people doing that sort of work. There is still a challenge around security, and I'll talk about the skills gap in a moment. We've also got this notion up the top there about always on, that broadband's ubiquitous. Let me change that around and say there's almost no organisation now that is not connected to the internet at every point in time, or at least wants to be. That they're always on, they're always connected to the internet. And the last one, and this was a point a little bit like what Jeff was saying, that we need to understand the implications from a cybersecurity perspective of how IT-centric your organisation is, and understanding the strategic view of that or your organisation in terms of where you're going and how technology will enable your business to give value back to its stakeholders. So there's three driving forces around the value of cybersecurity, but there's a really fundamental shift happening right now. Okay, Internet of Things, and I've got the term Internet of Everything. How many here are aware of Internet of Things? Quite a few hands, okay. Maybe in a year or two you'll have a bit more, I'll have a few more hands up. The Internet of Everythings. We're putting sensors out there and artificial intelligence, machine decision making into devices that are operating for us where no human needs to take action. We're seeing it, for example, in automated or driverless cars. I was chatting with a few guys at the back today about an organisation in the mining space that has driverless trains taking minerals directly from the loader out to the port. No driver involved, and it travels hundreds of kilometres. So we're seeing technology now take control of things and make decisions by itself. And there's quite a few examples out there, right down to kids' toys. I think I might have a little kids' toy on there. I might have removed it. Refrigerators, a whole range of things. I was presenting at a training course maybe a year or so ago, and I asked the room, it was an IT risk course, I asked the room, was anyone here in their organisation using Internet of Things connected devices? And nobody put their hand up, which I found surprising. So I threw a few teasers out like these. Okay, anyone using maybe aircon sensors or something simple? And I threw out refrigerators. Does anyone here use Internet connected refrigerators? And one guy put his hand up. He says, yes, we do. He was, no surprises, in the aged care space. And what his refrigerators were doing out there in aged care facilities was storing pharmaceuticals, medicines, which needed to be stored at a certain temperature. And his facilities manager out there in aged care facility had rung up IT and said, hey, we need to connect these fridges to our network. How do we do that? And the IT people were thinking, whoa, what's this all about? We can't let that happen. But the business needs that to happen. So organisations are increasingly seeing the connection of Internet of Things or Internet of Everything devices to their IT network to enable the business to do what the business needs to do. So technology is at the heart of everything we do now, whether it's social or consumer or business interactions. But along with that comes risk. And I loved hearing Jeff talk about risk and opportunity, because this is the fundamental choice we all make. We have to make conscious choices to do technology, to use technology for enterprise value, but we need to be conscious of the risk, not overly scared of it. And I'm going to talk about risk management in a little while. Here's some examples that I had when I presented in Brisbane. So some of these date to about March, or maybe even a little earlier than that, some were last year. We're seeing organisations being breached, and we've got at the federal government at the moment, it's probably in a hiatus with the election at the moment, we've got a mandatory data breach notification bill that's been sitting around for a few years now. Whether it becomes law is going to be an interesting, perhaps, change in the next year or two, but organisations are going to have to start reporting, potentially, when they've been breached. The challenge I guess I have is I see risk managers often say that's a reputation damage. So we need to be careful that we don't jump or leap to that. There are other damages that is occurring before reputation. The main one being loss of service, loss of customer satisfaction, perhaps loss of revenue, and maybe even some expense being spent on recovery. So reputations are at risk, but there are other more day-to-day and mundane risks that we need to be managing. One of the things ISACA does, and we're pretty good at this, I think, we do surveys of and questionnaires and issues around exploring what the social issues are today. We did, back at the end of 2015, December 2015, we released this IT Risk Reward Barometer, and it asked questions in two different dimensions. We surveyed about 5,400 people in 5 countries, Australia, Mexico, UK, US and India. We asked them about their consumption of Internet Things devices and how satisfied they were or confident they were that there was security built in and that, that they should be good to use in your organisation. And what we found in my summary in the top right-hand corner, consumers feel a little overconfident about IoT, Internet of Things security. Consumers actually use these devices. They'll set privacy perhaps lower than what a business might like to set it as. But on the other hand, we found IT and cybersecurity professionals, out of the 7,000 companies we surveyed globally, we found IT and cybersecurity professionals are much less confident about it. They see the risks, they feel the pain more often. And there's obviously that paper that you can have a look at if you wish to look into the detail of that. And then there's this thread as well. So we're starting to see things like, and you may remember the Jeep Cherokee that was hacked as it was driving down the road as an example. We have the common problem with ransomware. In fact, Australia is one of the world's most targeted consumer groups around ransomware. I'm not sure whether there's an awareness problem among our consumers on social engineering. And lastly, we even had that hack or that attack on a website that contained data that was collected out of a child's toy. Okay, the toy had a connection back to the internet. The company was collecting children and parents' conversations, recording what they were doing, and that data was made available through a hack on the web. So we're starting to see this challenge not just at organisational level, but consumer-oriented threats as well. My query on this one, the reason I raise it here, is some of us work in businesses that build these products and services that need to take accountability for it being secure by design, not secure after it's been deployed. Secure by design, giving consumers the right tools for them to make their privacy and security choices. And in many of these circumstances, the consumer was not really capable or competent of doing that. The last and more dangerous area is this one called advanced persistent threats. Anyone aware of that concept? If I was talking a few years ago, Jeff in Department of Defence, it might have been the only person in the room particularly concerned about it. What sort of organisation are you in? Absolutely. Critical infrastructure, anyone in kind of defence or federal government, anyone working in intelligence, they were the organisations being targeted by things called advanced persistent threat. But we're seeing it now starting to appear in areas like banking and pharmaceuticals, areas where there is data of value that somebody may want to steal and use for their own purposes. So what is an advanced persistent threat? Just quickly, it is simply that. It is a threat that is advanced. In fact, it's usually multi-layered. It will start with one attack point, often social engineering. It will then gain a foothold on the network. It will then deploy another attack technique, which could be to try and penetrate internally into your network. And then it will try some data exfiltration techniques to steal the data that it's finally got a hold of. We did a survey of that. As I mentioned, ISACA does a number of surveys around this space. We did one towards the end of 2015, and we found some good and the bad. The bad news, 28% said that they'd experienced this type of attack, whether you want to call it APT, but they'd experienced an advanced attack, multi-layered, multi-attack point, focused on stealing corporate data, significant value data. We also saw organisations moving towards allowing freedom with mobile devices, bring your own devices and the like, but those are often the avenue of attack, the first foothold an organisation is going to feel with an APT. We also saw that 3/4 didn't update supplier agreements, yet no organisation today operates alone. Every organisation has suppliers that it is dependent on, or it is a supplier that some other organisation is dependent on. The supply chain is enormous. And the last bad news point was that organisations are heavily focused on building technical controls, yet we know that social engineering and the human element is often the starting point for these types of attacks. So organisations need to move their control model to include awareness, training, skills, and those sorts of things. Some good news, we're seeing increased visibility and leadership among organisations that we surveyed. So there is some good news. But let me put it in perspective as well. Now that we're all online in real time, and if you're in banking, if you're in a whole range of retail services, if you're in anything that offers a service out to the customer where the customer can look at your website, your IT outages are public. They know that your system is not running when they can't get to your web page to make a purchase. Okay? So don't be too caught up just in cybersecurity, remembering that human error back inside in your office, which is not caused by a cybersecurity threat, is just potentially as damaging. And the growing skills gap. Now, here's where we get a challenge in terms of how do we help organisations fill the gap that will enable them to close the problems that they've got. We know that there's a lead time for people to gain the skills to be cybersecurity experts. We know that the basic skills level of people in this space at the moment is probably not as high, and Jeff talked about the need to move towards that professionalisation of our workforce, and this is an area where organisations can do two things. One is hiring people with the credentials that will help them in the places they need help. But the second one is building the capability internally, spending money on training. So one area that you could look at is spending money on training your IT professionals, the people that are architecting and managing your network, architecting and deploying your servers, and maybe even your desktops, and skilling them to understand what are the key controls they need in your environment, in your risk space, What are the skills they need to build a defensive, protective, preventive model that will help mitigate the risk to some degree, knowing that there is a risk out there that may not be easily mitigated? So the skills gap is an area we've heard a lot about. The federal government just back in, I think it was March or April, released a cybersecurity strategy, which is very apolitical. IIA submitted a paper and we were quite pleased, at least with the 5 pillars they've come up with. Cybersecurity skills is certainly one of the key areas. So how does this fit in with audit? The first and obvious area around aligning with perhaps the role of auditors is looking at to what degree does cybersecurity risk and issue present compliance challenges. There's a plethora out there of legislation, and without trying to describe them all for you, don't trust my little list here, I just found a bunch that I'm aware of that have cybersecurity implications. Not only is there legislation, things like obvious ones like Privacy Act, you know, how we protect personal and private information in our enterprises. Not only are there those, but there are some internal or other regulatory issues like standards. Anyone collecting credit cards, for example, needs to look at the PCI standard, among others. So there's a plethora of these things out there. The challenge is really, how does your organisation manage its legal and regulatory cybersecurity obligations? And in many organisations, I'm finding this to be sort of a leave it to the operations people without building it together or looking at it and saying, how do we get better value out of managing these risks? Anyone here use COBIT 5? A couple? Okay, COBIT 5 is a model that's really effective. It's been around for quite a while now. In fact, it's 20 years old, maybe a month ago. This model has in the bottom corner there a little circle around it, a process around managing compliance obligations. So you don't need to go too much further to look at this and say, how do I go about doing that? And here's a walkthrough of the structure within that process. And the one I want to call out, because you can read those bullet points and I'm limited by time, the one I want to call out is the second one, optimising responses. What we don't want organisations to do is spend lots of money on managing all of their individual compliance regimes, when if you look at them all, very much they actually ask for the same control types to be in place. For example, that user access is governed, that access will be provided on a need-to-know basis or by authorised users only. That's a common requirement across many of those regulations and standards. And so something like a compliance mapping, and in my intro, Peter mentioned I do ISO 27001 training. So ISO 27001 has an annexure with some generic controls which map often to these sorts of compliance obligations. So you don't need to be ISO certified if you look at that annexure and start to say, okay, we've got privacy. Which of these controls in this annexure do we need to have in place? If we're APRA regulated, which are the ones in APRA, such as things like data protection, business continuity, outsourcing, they're all in the same model. So you can use a statement of applicability, which controls are applicable in my environment that I need to manage. You can use that kind of model to help you identify what the controls are. And then when you audit that control, access management as an example, you will know whether or not you're compliant across a range of regulatory policy frameworks. So the whole challenge around compliance with legislation exists, but organisations have a more fundamental problem, and that is, how do we embed cybersecurity into risk management? And the challenge, and Jeff has already said exactly what I was going to say, and that is we have to manage opportunity. Managing opportunity is the first thing we need to do. We need to make sure that when our organisation chooses to use technology for value in delivering its services, that it understands what the value is that they're after. And then we can deal with those risks that are going to impair the achievement of those outcomes, the cybersecurity specific risks that are going to play there. I actually use a fairly broad and holistic model here. So my model around this includes governance, establishing at the highest level in the organisation, accountability and alignment around cybersecurity. Okay? How does it affect our strategic outcomes? Who's accountable for it? What framework of policies and standards do we need to have in place? What monitoring and reporting should we have? All the stuff you'll see at governance. And I have a slide which I'll walk quickly through in a moment. From that, we then drive a risk management framework, cybersecurity being a part of that, not a specific framework in and of itself. I'll talk briefly about that in a moment. Then information security management. This is the expertise within your organization that brings this stuff together and say, okay, we've got technical controls, we've got people controls, we've got enterprise governance and risk. And the security management function brings all that together and manages and monitors perhaps a program of work to deliver the cybersecurity expectations. Business operations, these are the controls out in the day-to-day of doing work. Things like HR, things like IT operations, things like service delivery, things like physical security and environmental security, supplier management, all of those things fit under that box. The last one I've got there, incident response. There is a likelihood that your organisation will suffer an incident or an outage, a cybersecurity attack, a data breach, so you need a process to manage those incidents, preventive, detective, corrective processes around that. So that's the holistic model that I use to make sure that I've covered my enterprise end-to-end and deal with all of the scenarios. The next step that I often look at is organisations, I hear people talk about, and who's heard this phrase, people, process and technology, PPT, okay. It's a common thing. In my mind, it's incomplete, and it has been incomplete for a long time. This model around establishing these enablers is a much more complete model, and in fact you can look at these enablers across every one of those previous domains that I just covered. And these enablers, which draw from COBIT 5, help us to identify where do we have the right level of control, and are the controls effective, efficient, operating, designed the right way, etc. This model is quite useful for drilling in, and you can see there at number 6 on IT security, but it's much better in terms of looking across the enterprise holistically. I'll leave that for another course or another day or another session. You remember I said I have a governance model. It draws, this is a simplistic version that I use to help explain to leadership, business executives, the C-suite sort of people around what is it that governance should be doing and how do you specifically do this for information or cyber security. And it's built in the center there around, you can see the 3 key words, evaluate, direct and monitor. The cycle of what is it we need to do, directing the organisation to do it, and then monitoring how it is being done. The EDM cycle is right there in the middle. But there are inputs and outputs for our governors for them to make those decisions and to understand what they need to do on cyber security. And their direction down to the management function will include things like the kind of ISMS or ISO Plan, Do, Check, Act life cycle. I know that's a little dated according to 2013 standard, but the logic sort of still fits. So there's a simplistic model that you can use in your organisation to assess, okay, where are we in terms of governance? How well do we do these? How well does our leadership get the right inputs to enable them to evaluate and direct where we need to go with cybersecurity? Do they get the right inputs from management to help them monitor the current state of cybersecurity? Are we aware of where our cybersecurity risks and threats are today? So that model's a fairly easy one to walk through. From a risk perspective, and this is where I said we need to take caution, and we need to take the idea that we do business for value, we don't do business to manage security, okay? So an organisation has to start with this perspective and know the impact of cybersecurity. What are our strategies? What are our goals? What are our enterprise objectives? And how could cybersecurity, A, if we do it well, enable us to achieve those goals? Good security is good business, okay? Optimal security is good for business. But also, how could bad cybersecurity controls in our enterprise drag us back? How could it hold us back? How could it cause damage to us? And it's things like understanding information asset value. Let me give you an example. Anyone here in the health space? Aged care, health care, anything like that, health insurance? A couple, not so many, a few. What's interesting from the dark web, anyone here on the dark web? Don't raise your hand. Okay. If you're on the dark web, the value of healthcare data is around, and this is a fairly rough figure, it depends on where you go and what you're buying, is around 10 times more valuable than credit card data at the moment. So if you're in healthcare, I'd be interested to know, we won't talk about it just here, what you're doing around ensuring that your healthcare data is being protected. Because banks have been doing protection of credit card data for many years. In fact, financial services is probably the leading edge of cybersecurity control frameworks today. But healthcare is the next emerging industry for cyber criminals to go target, okay? So know the value of your assets, not just from the perspective of the value to your business, but its value to your attackers. Who wants to steal it? And how much will they make from it? And how hard is it for them? And is that a good proposition? Okay, is that a good criminal business model? Because there are certainly plenty of business models out there on the dark web if you want to try and hack or steal data. So no asset value to you and to your attackers. And no asset value to your consumers, because your consumers are buying your products and services because it is of value to them. And if you were to buy a toy that you knew could be hacked, would you buy that toy versus one that you knew couldn't be, or that you could at least secure it? So there's a consumer value you need to understand as well, the value of cybersecurity to the consumer. Customer sat, service continuity, the rest on the list are fairly straightforward in terms of where do we, how important are these in the context of delivery of service, and how important are they, or at risk are they from a cyber perspective? I didn't want to dwell too much on policy frameworks. This has been around forever. I remember auditing in the 80s and looking at enterprise policies. I still feel like this is an area not done very well, that people say, I don't want to write a bunch of policies because we write them, we put them on the shelf and they're useless. So what we need to do is get policy on a page, policy in bullet points. I've written information security policies in 6 bullet points for an organisation, which led to quite effective structure of standards and guidance that emanated from that. So make sure these things are adding value and not just simply shelfware, if you like. Here's where I've got just a big long hit list of things. Your organisation quite possibly has been architected in a legacy sense from the old client-server days, where you've got servers somewhere in your internal network and you've got users connecting to those over copper cable or whatever it might be, Ethernet, wide area networks, maybe wireless these days, maybe even satellite. But we need to we need to understand the architecture principles from a cybersecurity perspective, because enterprises are changing. We need to understand, for example, do we have defence in depth? Can we protect at the crusty outside of our organisation through to where the data is? Do we have controls in place to mitigate damage or loss of that data? But do we also have defence in breadth? Have we got controls at all of the entry points of our network? Have we got controls at all of the users of the devices on our network? Have we got controls at our supply chain, at the front and back of the way in which we do business? So defence in breadth is as important as defence in depth. And so from an auditor perspective, looking at architecture and some of those bullet points, and it drills down into a little bit more detail as it goes down that list, understanding and looking at how well your enterprise has been architected and how well it will be architected as you move into things like cloud, social mobility. There's a session coming up on that in a moment. How we are going to be pushing more data out there on the consumer device and less data in our data centre, potentially. We need to understand what are the architectural controls in place and how are they adding or detracting from the cybersecurity risk that we face. IT security, there's an interesting issue here. I see a lot of organisations that say, isn't cybersecurity just an IT security issue? Isn't it just an issue for my IT function? Isn't this just about network security, firewalls and things like that? And certainly to some degree, that's where the heavy duty controls actually lie. But down the bottom there, one of the really interesting things that we're seeing is the emergence of 2 things. One is emergent security tools. So security as a service, so organisations buying an external service provider to manage enterprise network security, not done in-house. That's an interesting one. The other one is the degree of technological change. I mentioned already the refrigerator. So IT operations are increasingly needing to go out to the wider parts of the business and say, what technology are you buying? What shadow IT is out there that's taking our data out of our nice controlled data centre and putting it out on the web, putting it in a cloud provider, putting it out in terms of a mobile device that may or may not have the control that we expect. So understanding how these controls are operating and how they work for you in your organisational context is becoming more and more important in terms of those last 2 points, emerging change. Awareness. How many people here are doing anything around cybersecurity awareness in their organisation? Quite a few, good to see. Would have liked all of the hands up. There's two dimensions to this in my mind. One is awareness of people within your business. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward. It's explaining or working with your leadership around what is cybersecurity, how could they be targeted. There are some case studies of organisations where the executives were targeted quite directly with things called spear phishing, and those executives who often have high authority roles get targeted by these sorts of attacks, and they get their credentials stolen. So they're often key people in terms of security awareness. But going across to the line of business, and this is where it steps out of being IT to being a business issue, going over to your line of business and working with them to help them understand what is the role of technology in delivering their product or service to the consumer, and how does cybersecurity impact them? How would it impact the line of business that they are involved in? What are some of the attack vectors that they would be exposed to that they might have not enough control or sufficient control, or dare we say it, too much control? Okay? Staff is an obvious one. The more and more we use mobile devices, the more and more we are mobile, the more, and probably many of us here are checking our work email right now, the more we push that data outside our boundary, the more people need to be conscious and aware of not only things like social engineering, but whether you're using a Wi-Fi network that might be stealing your data as you enter it. And importantly also, and I mentioned this under the cybersecurity skills gap, the IT team. Specific, hard focus on these people to help them understand what are the key controls. What should they be monitoring or looking for? There was a phrase, I think it came up with Jeff's session, KPIs. It might have been a question asked, or used the phrase, I think, KPIs. I like to see whether an organisation has key risk indicators. Indicators that their cybersecurity risk is trending in a direction they don't want, or maybe in a direction they do want. Now, those things are not easy to develop, but they really do need to be developed primarily within IT, because that's where you'll often start to see the attacks. Service desk help calls is an example. But there's another side of awareness, and it's the other side there. How dependent is your business on cybersecurity awareness of things like your customers? Okay? What are they doing with your products that make them at risk of cybersecurity? And I've given a really good example there on the toys. But also the supply chain, and don't forget cleaning, maintenance, any of those suppliers that come into your business that have some method of accessing physically or logically your IT or your information. Anyone here remember the Target, US company called Target that got attacked December, maybe 2 or 3 years ago? Do you remember the attack path for that? It was their heating air conditioner supplier was the vector of attack there. So they were attacked through a heating and air conditioning supplier. The company called Home Depot in the US, their attack vector was they were deploying point-of-sale devices in a rollout, and those point-of-sale devices were compromised before they were rolled out. So their supplier had already been targeted, their supplier's product had already been compromised, and Home Depot was the one that was that suffered in the end. So cleaning, maintenance, supply chain, the products you're using, all of that are really critical areas to go and look at. So the last question, I guess, on this particular bullet point is, have you tested it? How many people have tested the awareness of people, or that list? How many people have run one? There's quite a few. Social engineering. Can I get some examples of what you may have done? What sort of things?
Can't really share it at the moment. It's a current piece of
Okay. Okay, and I won't even mention where you're from. That's good to see. Yours?
Yeah, happy to. Actually, more from Telstra.
Okay.
So we did an audit where we actually hired an external firm to help us. And we sent phishing emails just to see what kind of advice.
Was it successful?
Successful both ways.
Okay.
For the awareness, but if you call success, lots of clicks.
Right. There was one more. Thank you.
It's a really interesting exercise.
Absolutely.
We haven't done that. Now our Chief Information Security Officer is doing that on a regular basis now.
Excellent, excellent. There was one more over the back there. What was your example, without too much detail?
Yeah, so I work for a university, and one of our students did a PhD around security awareness. So we sort of received the results of that, fed it to our risk committee, and that was some things like, is it safe to connect your laptop to a public network? What would you do if this happened? It was really sort of general question.
Right.
and then just trying to allocate some benchmark.
Right. Be interested in reading that. We'll catch up later. Social engineering. I've run these as well. There's a couple of really critical points to them, and it's great to see them being run out of audit and then passed over to the business. I asked the question quite deliberately, was it successful? Because there's a couple of measures of success. For one of my organisations, the one where I was the security partner for a multi-year program of work, I actually presented their awareness training to all of their staff and all of their leadership, all their executives, the CEO and the lot. And after that, we then tested their awareness. And I talked to them about social engineering risk. I talked to them about what are the methods that social engineering attacks, how do they come into us? What might they look like? What would you do? And we skilled them to some degree. We then actually executed a bunch of tests. The first one was a fairly obvious, sending someone to their office to see how much physical access they could get to anything. And what was really interesting about this was it was financial services industry. I told my penetration tester, the kind of ethical hacker team who usually have blue jeans and a black t-shirt kind of look, I told them they needed a suit and tie. They needed to go in looking like they were professionals because I didn't want, they would have obviously looked stupid walking around the floor of a financial services industry in a pair of jeans and a black t-shirt. So they went and dressed up and they turned up on the Friday morning for our planned physical social engineering exercise. And unfortunately, it was casual dress day. But here's what happened. Here's where behaviours and the dependence on a critical fundamental control failure occurred. The receptionist asked them, were you the auditors? So they said, yes, we are. And so from that point on, they were actually given everything they could possibly ask for, everything they wanted. They connected to the networks. They sat in the CEO's chair and took some pics. They got all the keys to all the cupboards. And unfortunately, it looked really bad when we presented it. So my question, was it successful? As the trainer, very bad. It made me feel very bad that I hadn't actually lifted their skills to say, hang on, who are you two? Can I see some credentials? Can I see where you're from? Who are you meant to be meeting with? So that one was good and bad. We then followed it up with a fairly typical kind of approach. We didn't do phishing. We did a phone call. So what we did was we had a list from HR that they had trimmed down to 13 random names. We didn't know who they were, what role they had. We just had a phone number. So my pen test team, my hacker team, gave them a call. We had a standard script so that we weren't going to do anything different as we went through the list. When she got to the first person on the phone, she said, hello, my name is X. I'm from your IT help desk. We've got a problem with your computer. We need to remote log in to fix it, but to do that, I need your login and password. And the person said, wonderfully, no, I don't believe you. I'm going to ring the help desk because I don't think that's a valid call. So she hung up. She didn't just hang up. She did tell the help desk. So my pen tester rang the second person, same thing. Third person, same thing. What was really cool was it wasn't that the individuals did tell the help desk that this was perhaps a problem. It was that the help desk saw a pattern of attack. And so they sent an email to everyone in the organisation. We are getting a call from somebody called X who purports to be from our help desk, who claim that they are here to help us, but it is not a valid call. Do not answer her questions. Do not give her any information. It worked 100%, let me say 99-ish%, because one person was working from home and had their phone call forwarded, took the call on their mobile phone, gave up their details to my attacker because they didn't get the email. They were working from home. So I thought pretty confident that it was successful. And when we followed it up the next time, we got a very low hit rate the second time. We followed it up with things like USB sticks. It's so easy to do these sorts of things. So if your organisation is going to look at its cybersecurity footprint, its cybersecurity risk, it really does need to understand how capable are your people of spotting an attack, of dealing with the attack, responding to it, and how will the enterprise fabric of control operate effectively in the time frame it's required. And these are wonderful tests to do. Expectations of assurance. Here's where it got really tricky. So what should assurance audit be looking to do as part of cybersecurity? And Peter, you're keeping track of my time here. I could talk for weeks. Good. There was a document came out from IIA that talked about internal audit's role in cyber preparedness. It's interesting, it's brief, it covers some key points, which is really good. There's some cybersecurity awareness that perhaps supports that to some degree, and I've got it on two frames here, two sides. I've got it on one side, assurance. Now this is where I like to see operational controls and the self-testing, the monitoring and self-assurance that we actually have the controls in business. These are BAU potential approaches that I like to see out there. Over on the other side, I've got your sort of more traditional IT audit stuff. I don't mind a bit of crossover of the two of them. For example, we often see pen testing being started out of the audit team but eventually handed over as a programmatic activity that somebody in the business does, perhaps a chief information security or the like. You'll see on there things like social engineering, red teaming. Anyone know red teaming, what that means? One up the back. Red teaming, yeah, just the one. Red teaming is where you have a blue team in the defence corner and a red team in the attack corner. And you let them go at it and try and attack the organisation to see how well your organisation can defend and how open to various attack forms it is. There are lots of ways in which you could run those sorts of tests. It's a little bit, is that a question? No, it's a little bit like BC and DR, but it's specifically around cybersecurity incidents, cybersecurity scenarios. So there's a range of things there that you might be interested to look at. You could, for example, look at the degree to which your organisation, if it's building software, does it do code review? How well is the code written? How secure is the code? How well is it architected with secure by design, as I mentioned earlier today? ISAC has also worked with, not only internally with our volunteers, so ISACA is an organisation of over 140,000 volunteers, members and many volunteering their time. We've worked with organisations on the right-hand side, left from your side, worked with the North American company directors to produce a guide called the questions, I guess, that boards need to ask around cybersecurity. So there is that there for you already. There's another guide there on security as a service. Might be hard to read, but the one in green down the bottom is a primer around industrial control systems. Okay, how to secure your SCADA networks might be useful in the internet of in the critical infrastructure space. And then over on the right, some useful guides and assurance practices around a range of typical IT areas like mobile devices, just trying to spot that in the different distance, vendor management, configuration management, those sorts of things. So there is definitely guidance out there that you can draw upon to help you build audit programs around any of these if you want to do the deep look into them. The last point I wanted to cover, and I hope I'm running on time here, a couple of minutes, good, some questions, happy to take questions, is responsible innovation. Now notice I'm not just saying innovation for the sake of building new products and services, but understanding the responsibility around it. A key piece of work that ISACA did last year, 2015 I think it was we produced a series of videos, and I did used to have the video embedded here, but it doesn't always work in conferences depending on the technology. So I put in the comments. So Rob Clyde, he's a managing director of a consulting company. He's holds a claim to developing the world's first intrusion prevention detection systems a long time ago. He's a bit of a venture capitalist. But he's also a director on ISACA's International Board of Directors. And he talks and presents a lot around innovation. And he has this wonderful comment which is really important for organisations to remember. And that is that innovation is not a straight line, as you can read it. You have to tolerate some failure. And so if your organisation has a view that change and projects have to lead to successful outcomes, then the chance is that you'll overinvest in those things and miss the mark. So Rob's point is a really interesting one about companies that have no tolerance for failure in innovation will in fact fail. I think the key point from a cyber perspective is to make sure you roll into that innovation and those change activities an understanding, just as Jeff has said already, of what is the opportunity and what are the risks, and squeeze those risks down into the things that you're able to manage and understand your enterprise appetite for cyber risk. There was another paper, and this was followed by a series of papers around things like machine intelligence or machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, which looked at the business adoption and innovation issues around new technology and emerging technology. And again, it followed a similar point. The authors of this came up with very much the same outcome, is that while we might be putting more and more technology out on the internet, we need to look at, as it says there, businesses that innovate around the right trends are more likely to strengthen their competitive edge. What I think is critical, again, is to consider the cybersecurity elements in innovation. So how many people here are auditing or looking at the way in which their business innovates and the degree to which cybersecurity is a part of that from a strategic agenda perspective, as Jeff has said already? This is a slide that's almost the same as the opportunity risk one. Okay, it comes from a document, actually it's a few years old now, 2009. ISACA was exploring and certainly talking about that with IT comes opportunity and with IT comes risk, and the need to manage both sides of that in terms of innovation. Once again, our COBIT-5 model, those of you that are familiar with it, has a process in here around managing innovation. And so there's some useful guidance in that around how you can look at innovation and the implications for your organization, as well as picking up the cybersecurity piece. I'll just skip through that slide. Lastly, and I hope I'm on track here to wrap up and take some questions. Lastly, what was really interesting, last year I presented in Fiji on assurance in an age of innovation and the challenges around how we adopt technology and where the auditor's role might be shifting in this space. And I also, in the same day, presented a 4-hour course in cybersecurity. And what came out the morning I was leaving Sydney to fly there was the Protivity paper that ISACA did with Protivity. And it was a look at or a survey of the top audit challenges. And you wouldn't be surprised to read that the #1 challenge for IT audit was change and innovation. And the implications, as it says there, of cybersecurity in organizations today. So right up there with the #1 perspective out of this particular survey, and it may vary, was the challenge around how do we manage cybersecurity while also adopting more technology in our enterprise to do more, different, better, or cheaper. And so there's a really fundamental challenge for auditors, and it was, I'm not answering the question around how I resolve the challenge, but there is agreement that this is an issue for us to get our heads around. How we go forward with that, perhaps looking at my structured model around my holistic governance, risk, security management, business operations, and incident response. That's a neat, holistic approach. Take your risk framework and your governance frameworks and work out where and when and how cybersecurity impacts your business is probably a really useful starting point. So there's certainly some challenges ahead. I'm looking forward to, as you can tell, the challenge of continuing to help organizations manage cybersecurity. There's lots of flavors of it and a lot more detail I could go into, but that's pretty much how I wanted to run the session in terms of depth and breadth